The Confederate States of America was the product of ambition made by the United States Southerners who felt that the federal government had begun a trend of centralizing its power over its citizenry. The people of the Southern states sought a government body that's interests were more close to home and one that was to be run by officials who understood those interests firsthand. Under the provisions outlined in the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, these states felt that succession was a right they held to protect them from an unwanted and unjust government. The initial line of succession from the Union were the Deep South states that began on December 20th, 1860 with South Carolina, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and ending with Texas on February 1st, 1861. These 7 states' rapid pace of declaring independence, all succeeding within 6 weeks of each other, called for the need to quickly organize a convention to discuss unifying an independent nation of the South. The first 6 states all sent delegates to gather in Montgomery, Alabama on February 4th, 1861. Texas, having just succeeded, did not have time to send representatives. After 4 days of session, the original Confederate States of America was born on February 8, 1861. Then, a month later, on March 2nd, Texas joined the Confederacy. The Confederate States of America was comprised with these 7 states when the Civil War officially began with the Battle of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. However, it was not yet done growing. 5 days later, on April 17th, Virginia submitted its secession from the Union, followed in May with Arkansas and Tennessee within a day of one another, and North Carolina 2 weeks later on May 20th, 1861. These states were known as the Upper South states for being the most northern in the Confederacy. These states felt compelled to join the CSA since its diplomatic goals were more aligned with their states than that of the Union government. These states also were under extreme pressure of choosing sides after it became apparent that their states were between the borders of the new Confederacy and that of the Union, and if any hostility were to arise, they would have to face it from both sides if remaining neutral. After Virginia's admission, the capital of the Confederacy was moved to Richmond, Virginia, where it stayed till the end of the war. In November and December of 1861, the states of Missouri and Kentucky joined the Confederate States of America. However, these 2 states never supported the Confederacy militarily during the Civil War, but they did send delegates to the Confederate Congress. With these 2 additions, the CSA peaked its highest with a total of 13 states. From the years of its existence from 1860 to 1865, the CSA had 3 sessions of Congress. Provisional Congress from February 4th, 1861 to February 17th, 1862, the First Confederate Congress from February 18th, 1862 to February 17th, 1864, and the Second Confederate Congress from May 2nd, 1864 to March 18th, 1865. The 2 Confederate Congresses were comprised of officials selected by popular vote held in general elections in each state. The first session was immediately following the convention at Montgomery, Alabama. It was this entity that ordered the bombardment of Fort Sumter and adopted the first flag of the Confederacy, which became to be known as the Stars and Bars. This newly formed Confederate Congress was considered provisional due to its quick creation and having no public caucus for selection of officials. It was the duty of this Congress to form a confederacy of the states that have seceded from the Union and to report a plan for a lasting government for the same upon the basis of the Constitution of the United States. The Provisional Confederate Congress produced its own Constitution for the South to follow. The preamble declared that each state was acting in its sovereign and independent character. Under the aphorism of Hal Cobb's oratory at the Montgomery Convention, this Constitution served the great duty imposed upon providing for these states a government for their future security and protection. The Confederate Constitution greatly mirrored the United States Constitution. In fact, the first 12 amendments were copied verbatim. The key differences being that it omitted the general welfare clause that Southerners felt was the source of construed augmentation of federal power the Union had used during the antebellum period. The CSA Constitution was silent on nullification, forbade national legislature from enacting tariffs or funding internal improvements under Article 1, Section 9, stating, "Congress shall not pass any law denying or impairing the right of property to Negro slaves." The legislative branch was separated into the House of Representatives and the Senate, allowing the same requirements and circumstances to apply for its officials as those previously held by the U.S. Constitution. The executive branch greatly reflected Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. It held the departments of State, Treasury, War, Navy, Justice, and a post office. However, it was more limiting to office of the President. The Confederate Constitution stated that the President could hold a cabinet but would only have line-item veto power and discretionary authority to dismiss civil officers. Also, the president of the CSA could only be elected to one 6-year term. The judicial branch, outlined in the Confederate Constitution, was an exact reflection of that of the Union's. High power was vested in the Supreme Court, and lower federal courts were used as they were used before secession. However, the Supreme Court of the Confederacy never came to be to disputes in Congress on how much authority and power it should be given. The administration and cabinet of the Confederate States of America shifted around due to its sudden birth and short-lived existence. The CSA came to an end in 1865 after diplomats failed in peace negotiations with Abraham Lincoln at Hampton Roads on February 3rd. 3 days later, President Davis appointed Robert E. Lee to the position of General-in-Chief. It was Lee who finally signed the Confederacy surrender at Appomattox, Virginia on April 9, 1865. Although the Confederate States of America did not survive the Civil War and it had a very short existence, the diplomats and its government made a few great accomplishments under their circumstances. They were able to create their own constitution to suit their needs and confirm cabinet posts for a new centralized government. The first year of the war was fought with a short-term direct volunteer system that resulted in early Confederate victories on the battlefield. In 1862, the Confederate Congress successfully passed a conscription act to provide more troops for the war effort. In 1863, the CSA passed the first income tax law that provided $320 million needed to finance the war.
In order to understand the nature of the Confederate government and its diplomatic relations throughout the war, it is important to know about the trends in their economy and how Southern leaders went about trying to create a system of economic sustainability that was both independent of their northern counterparts and a useful means by which to maintain the war effort. Putting moral and political ties aside, the effectiveness of the Southern economy would in part dictate how other countries would view them as an emerging country, and would determine whether or not they would be recognized on an international level. Much of the reason behind why Great Britain and France chose not to support the Confederacy is directly related to the failures of the Southern economy. The Confederate States of America had an economy that was remarkably different from their northern counterparts. Most notably, the Confederate economy was agrarian-based, whereas the Union economy was largely based on manufactured goods. This would result in problems for the South as the war progressed, since there would always be a lack of manufactured goods, such as firearms, ammunition, uniforms, shoes, and other countless items needed to maintain a standing army. But Southern leaders had a plan in order to use their great agricultural wealth, specifically using the power of King Cotton, to their advantage. Their plan was to pressure foreign powers dependent on their cotton exports to come to their aid. Appropriately named Cotton Diplomacy, it was the belief of many Southern planters and diplomats that they had control over the world cotton trade, and with this power they could bring countries like Great Britain and France to their side if enough incentive were provided. Immediately following the Trent Affair of 1861, the Confederates had legitimate reason to believe that they would receive international support. However, the Lincoln administration was able to avoid foreign involvement, which, in the end, would serve to isolate the Confederacy. However, the Confederates would put significant pressure on foreign governments by placing a temporary embargo on cotton shipments. In the long term, this would end up hurting the Confederacy more than their European counterparts, since even after the embargo was lifted, the Union blockade of Southern trade would become exceedingly more effective. Throughout the course of the war, the Confederacy was able to export a little over 400,000 bales of cotton to Europe. This number sounds impressive, but pales in comparison to the millions of bales they had been exporting before the war. The Confederacy may have believed that Great Britain and France would bend to their will, but the truth was that these countries had already looked into alternative options for obtaining cotton. In addition to their failures on the international stage, the Confederacy faced many economic problems from the start. One of the main reasons for why the South would lose the war would be because of their economic instability. Part of this was because the Confederate government had to create an economy, currency, and banking system from scratch, whereas the North already had a well-established economic system in place. In addition to their failures on the international stage, the Confederacy faced many economic problems from the start. One of the main reasons for why the South would lose the war would be because their economy lacked stability. Part of this was because the Confederate government had to create an economy, currency, and banking system from scratch, whereas the North already had a well-established system in place. The Confederate economy was also highly decentralized compared to the North, leading to inefficiencies in the production and distribution of goods throughout the states. In relating to distributions, the South also lacked a well-organized railway system that the North had, which limited the ability of manufacturers to get their products to troops on the front. In a way, the Confederacy adopted a form of state socialism to compensate for uneven oversight. Abraham Myers, who was appointed to Quartermaster General of the Confederate States Army, began to dictate the Southern manufacturing industry by putting price controls on certain goods and controlling the abilities of private industries to work efficiently. One of the greatest failures of the Confederate economy was their currency. Unlike the Union, where newly implemented greenbacks were guaranteed as legal tender for all debts, both public and private, the Confederate currency was not guaranteed for all transactions. This led many in the South to ask for gold instead of banknotes, since the value of the currency had a tendency of depreciating over time. And as predicted, the currency did depreciate. It was reported that the Confederate dollar was worth 90% in gold in 1861. This then fell to 16% by 1863, and then down to 5% in 1864. This led many in the South to believe that the CSA currency would eventually fail, and many soldiers and laborers began to ask for the Union greenback instead as payment. Although the Confederate government had sought to establish an independent economic system, in the end they were still dependent on foreign trade, which had been the basis for their economy before the war. This was made difficult by the effective coastline blockade of the North, which decimated their cotton industry. They had believed the cutting off of cotton exports to France and Great Britain would bring the two countries on their side, but their gamble failed to pay off in the end, and they were left to fight the Union on their own without the economic and military support provided by European nations.
By March of 1861, the Confederate Secretary of State Robert Toombs dispatched the Confederacy's first diplomatic envoys to Europe. Their mission was simple: to seek treaties of commerce and amity, acquire military arms, and official recognition as a sovereign nation. These envoys were William Yancey, Pierre A. Rost, and Ambrose Dudley Mann. They were possibly the poorest choices to send abroad. Yancey, the head of the delegation, was a known champion of slavery who saw it as a blessing to humanity and strongly believed the slave trade should be reopened. Pierre Rost had no formal diplomatic qualifications. Rather, he was sent abroad because he knew the French language and its culture. Ambrose Mann had diplomatic experience and had been the United States Assistant Secretary of State from 1853 to 1855. However, his noted lack of insight bred an incurable optimism that limited his actual usefulness as a diplomat. Later, Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin would recall that Mann was the type of man who would have all the right facts in front of him but would arrive at the wrong conclusion every single time. The mission was ordered to head to Britain, then proceed to the courts of Napoleon III of France, Alexander II of Russia, and Leopold of Belgium, with the instructions to complete treaties of states' rights. The instructions, however, lack important notes on how the mission was to deal with certain issues that needed consideration, and those included naval blockade of southern ports, European aversion to privateering, lack of wheat and cotton in England, trade with the North, and of course slavery. The envoy was also instructed to maintain that the act of secession was not an act of rebellion, but rather it was a legitimate move afforded to them by the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. In April of 1861, President Lincoln ordered the blockade of southern ports to prevent the South from exporting cotton to foreign countries. Though initially enraged, Confederate diplomats Yancey and Mann wrote in diplomatic cables that the blockade question we consider to be the great lever which will eventually decide the relations between Europe and the South, meaning they hoped the blockade would create a shortage of cotton in England, which would force England to have the Royal Navy open the blockade by force. England and France declared themselves neutral throughout the Civil War, a move that allowed England to continue to buy cotton and allowed the South to buy arms and equipment overseas. The London Armory Company became a battleground for these diplomats. The company sold arms to both sides, but preference was given to the Confederacy. They honored their pre-existing Union contracts, but gave the Confederacy equipment at much lower costs. The London Armory Company became the quasi-official supplier of the Confederacy. Private English shipbuilders were also under contract to build Confederate vessels, making England's neutrality a hypocrisy. This hypocrisy was seen in the depiction of John Bull, who is the personification of England in a variety of political cartoons published in Harper's Weekly. In England, there was widespread sympathy for the Confederacy. That sympathy was based along class lines. The English working class usually sided with the Union and saw the war as a struggle between free egalitarian laborers in the North against the South that sought to preserve a structured society headed by an aristocracy. The English middle and upper classes saw in the South a genteel, romantic way of life threatened by industrial vandals. Lord Westbury, the Lord Chancellor, publicly came out in support of the South and said that the North represented an arrogant and encroaching people, and England had no interest in siding with the Union against the CSA, who most resembled the mother country. The public opinion highly favored the CSA. The English government was still very suspicious of the strength of the Confederacy. In November of 1861, Charles Wilkes, a U.S. Navy officer, captured 2 Confederate diplomatic envoys aboard the British mail ship the Trent. England accused the U.S. of violating British neutrality and this incident created a diplomatic crisis between the US and Great Britain during the war, which is now known to us as the Trent Affair. On the Trent were diplomats John Slidell and James Mason. They were on their way to Europe to replace Ross and Yancey. Mason and Slidell slipped through the US naval blockade through Charleston, South Carolina, and headed for Cuba, where they climbed aboard the Trent. Captain Wilkes intercepted and, without permission from Washington, ordered his lieutenant to board and search the ship. They took Mason, Slidell, and their secretaries as prisoners, but they allowed the Trent to sail towards England. Initially, because of the defeat at Bull Run, the US celebrated the event as a victory, but British cried foul. They demanded the release of the Confederate envoys as well as a formal apology. Although still neutral, England ordered additional troops to Canada and ships to the Western Atlantic. By December 26 of 1861, the US presented an official note to the British minister to the US stating that the prisoners were to be released and conceded that Wilkes had made a mistake by not seizing the Trent and letting the courts affirm the legality of taking contraband prisoners. The Trent Affair confirmed that the British were willing to defend their position of neutrality in the American Civil War, a position that both the Union and Confederacy had hoped to change. In July of that year, Slidell met with Emperor Napoleon of France, where Napoleon made his position clear. Napoleon applauded Confederate victories and supported the Confederacy, all unofficially, of course. He further told Slidell that he could not take official action without support of England, who had repeatedly ignored his official and unofficial suggestions that they take a joint intervention in the Civil War. By August of 1862, the relationship between Britain and the Confederacy began to disintegrate. The government of Britain began to distance themselves from the Confederate diplomats and refused to hold any formal meetings. Instead, they sent the Confederate mission a letter stating, "The time has not, in the judgment of Her Majesty's government, yet arrived for recognition." Napoleon, who had been privately outspoken months earlier, clarified his position, stating that the American question had to be dealt with carefully. Any military intervention without English support would destroy French commerce. The envoys still attempted to gain French support, but the attempt was futile. France's commitment to Poland, which was seen uprising against the Russian Empire, was much more of a pressing concern to France. By February of 1863, Confederate diplomats were being shunned in both England and France. The demoralized and defeated team returned to the South. Judah P. Benjamin, Secretary of State, called President Davis' cabinet into session, where it was agreed that all consuls and consular agents of the British government be expelled from residing or engaging in business within limits of the Confederacy. England responded by issuing an order stating that any British subjects caught fighting in Confederate organizations would be treated as rebels and traitors. Any hope for legitimate recognition from abroad was now gone. The Confederacy's unwillingness to deal with the slavery question abroad also contributed to England's non-intervention status, which was apprehensive about acknowledging a new nation that tolerated slavery.
I have given up my life.